So since the last forum, we've witnessed the devastating impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the catastrophic explosion of conflict in Gaza. The Geneva Academy reports that there are 110 armed conflicts taking place in the world right now, with 45 of those taking place through the Middle East and North Africa. So we feel that, as Bishop Mike has said, that it's right for us to pause and to consider our duties and responsibilities as part of the worldwide church. And to lead us together in this, we invite John Cooper to guide us. So John, as you make your way to the platform, let me just give a little bit about you. So John is the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in England and Scotland. The Fellowship of Reconciliation is a faith-shaped peace, justice and non-violence movement with branches around the world, exploring links between climate change, war and peace. John has worked on questions of peace and justice across a range of church spaces and through Christian Aid, the Joint Public Issues Team and All We Can. So John, we invite you now to help us guide us in a call to peace. Thank you, John.
It's December last year, and I'm sat in a room like this with representatives from a wide range of churches like this, under the leadership and guidance of a range of people, including Archbishop Nikitas, like this. But there the similarities end, because the conference I was attending was focused on a major question of our time. What would a just peace look like for Ukraine? We had people with different theologies, different perspectives, all gathered in one space. We had speakers who had left Ukraine to sit among us and share their stories. As someone working for one of the oldest peace movements in the world, you can imagine there was lots I agreed with and a fair amount that I was slightly less comfortable with. But there was one throwaway sentence shared by an evangelical pastor, part-time military chaplain, and worker with the Bible Society that struck me deeply. We were in a small conversation about 5 different countries all around a table. And he estimated that children in Ukraine have now spent more time in bomb shelters than in schools in the last 3 years. Now, I don't know what situations each of you have left behind to come to this gathering, nor do I know what the different stories and experiences swept up in your congregations, be they multicultural or monocultural, or what you encounter through your regional, national, and for some of you, international roles. What I do know is most of us in the room have never had to think, let alone find ourselves saying, that the children we know have spent more time in bomb shelters than in school in the last few years. I'd just like to invite Pastor Agbo to come and light this peace candle, which will slowly burn as I talk. As it's lit, I'm going to give you some information on the place of war and conflict in the world today. It is estimated that about 1 in 8 of the world's population are currently exposed to violence and conflict. 50 countries around the world are in situations where levels of conflict could be described as high or turbulent. The doomsday clock sits at 89 seconds to midnight. And in February this year, Crisis Watch indicated Bosnia, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Guinea-Bissau, Israel, Palestine, Nicaragua, and Sudan were all deteriorating to increased levels of conflict. While many of our minds may bring up some of those different situations, it's also worth recognizing that a lot of conflicts are not between countries. Research carried out in 2022 found that over 30% of the 174 conflicts active at the moment were within states. They're often paramilitary or other groups fighting either government or sometimes, and I will never fully footnote this, on behalf of government, multinationals or other firms. If you want to go digging, speak to people linked to Nigeria or Colombia, and then you begin to see how murky and violent pursuit of profit can be. The last 3 years have, though, seen an acceleration and increase in state-based conflict, most notably when Russia crossed internationally recognized borders and restarted a long simmering conflict in Ukraine. That led to a dramatic reshaping of Western political and security alignment, where military spending increased by the end of a year ago to $2.4 trillion. And in March this year, just as I was beginning to put some things together and things kept changing week in, week out, European nations alone somehow found 800 billion euros worth of extra money to put into military spending. And those are just the big bits of conflict and violence. The increase in the far-right political activity, which destabilizes communities, invokes racism, and turns streets into places of violence, is a stain upon our world. And it's an increasing one around Europe. I have the privilege of speaking to like-minded people in all sorts of countries around Europe, and it is frightening to hear some of the stories, but heartening to hear the church is at the center of standing up, learning the lessons of its inherited racism and saying, no, our faith, our life, our work is better when we reflect the rainbow of people and perspectives sat within our congregations. We'll hear later about artificial intelligence, but never forget that's not passive. That's built by human hands. And if any of you tried to ask the recently released Chinese version, you'll soon learn that asking it basic questions like, what happened in Tiananmen Square, soon brings a non-answer. We are in a world which is stuck in a constant cycle of conflict within itself. Nations lift up sword against nation, and no one is free of the lasting impact of war. Just look at your own shopping bills and the difference the removal of easy access to sunflower oil in Ukraine built upon basics. And then you speak to nations in the global south who relied upon the grain that was grown in Ukraine and now are struggling to feed their populations, but because the global grain stocks have dropped, traditional patterns of aid and help are also struggling because there is less food about. In about a month's time even, we will retell the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Many churches will come alive with palm fronds, and will remember how the people who celebrate Jesus one week often turn their back and demand his crucifixion the next. This year, as we follow the reading from Luke, we'll hear the place of peace within the story. First, the people cry, peace in heaven and glory in the highest, as he charges through. But then Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. We hail the heaven-born Prince of Peace when he is born. He laments our inability to see peace as he begins to face his death. But we are called into bringing glimpses of that kingdom in which we proclaim there is peace through our work that we're doing or learning from our Orthodox friends, opening our eyes to the work already in action around us and feeling ourselves drawn to joining in. And what is the benefit? Think on the Sermon of the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessings for us and blessings for the world as we spend time thinking more deeply on inner peace, community peace, and world peace. But that path to be peacemaker is not easy. Jesus himself confronted one of the most powerful military machines the world has ever seen. And yet, at a moment when even he could have commanded a crowd of thousands to fight back, he knew he had a far greater force in his hand. The state may kill him, but he will rise from the dead as a clear rebuff to the brutality and violence meted out by humanity. And who knows, have we as followers ever truly come to terms with that moment of conflict and the place of love? Stanley Hauerwas suggests the call of the church is this: the church must never cease from being a community of peace and truth in a world of mendacity and fear. The church does not let the world set her agenda about what constitutes a viable social ethic. The church sets her own agenda. Then he goes on to talk, as we heard earlier, about caring for the poor and the outcast. We see the interlinking of questions of justice with peace. And another time, maybe down the bar, I'll tell you about FOR member Martin Luther King and his lifelong commitment and work to link questions of peace and justice. At his heart, Stanley is reminding us of the countercultural message of the church is not to conform to a world in which violence is seen, accepted, and seen as natural. We're being called to a deeper engagement, to listen to the outcast and to seek to mend all that is broken. And one of the most challenging moments is not talking about this in times of peace, but times of war. And in my day job, I hear stories of conscientious objectors from around the world. In Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, people are finding their faith leading them on a different path. Sometimes they see the place of war and weapons and refuse to take part. Others take part in activities and realize they're being called a different way and say, I need to stop. At all stages, the state tends to respond with brutality and delay, undermining the individuals and suggesting they are fake in their faith. And it's an outrage. Because if you spend time listening to the stories of those whose faith leads them to reject war and violence, you discover a deep faith that pushes them far beyond places that many of us will ever find ourselves challenged or asked. And in the UK, we have a special reason to remember that. We were the first country in the world to legally recognize the right to conscientious objection. That legal recognition in 1916, fought for by people spending years being brutalized and thrown in jail, then saw itself through into the United Nations Human Declaration on Human Rights, which then saw it become a globally recognized principle. But I'm going to take us back a few years earlier. Typius the martyr, who died in AD 304, was ordered to serve in the army. He answered, "Now I serve Christ. Before I served the world." When commanded a second time to take his place in the ranks, he responded, "No one returns from the battle. As far as I am concerned, I've conquered the world. I've enrolled among the servants of Christ. I'm a soldier of Christ. I serve Christ. And if you want to rage against me, it is for Christ that I shall suffer." Many churches at the moment are talking a lot about climate change. But have you ever thought about the fact that war kills the world twice? First, when individuals are killed by bullets, bombs, drones. Second, when the true carbon impact of mechanized warfare is felt and releases CO2 into the atmosphere. I'm not going to quiz you on the diagram, but what I'd like you to see and pay attention to is that the carbon emissions of warfare are not counted. And yet, if the Pentagon was a country, it'd be in the top 10 carbon emitters in the world once all of its carbon use was counted up. or you travel to the Holy Land, you see the devastation in Gaza. You hear from agencies like Oxfam who say, if you look at Gaza in January of this year, it would take the carbon equivalent of New Zealand's annual footprint to rebuild Gaza. And then we need to stand back, hear the figures, the money, the environmental cost, and say, is it a good use of the gifts from God to invest them in something that accelerates destruction all around, that kills people, that kills creation? I would probably say no. But we've got 3 days to learn to disagree well together. A lot of what I've brought you is a challenge about war, peace, and the headlines of its reality. And it's easy to fall in with the rest of the world and think weapons and guns are the only way we can ever solve things. Yet look around us here. Nearly 300 people representing a wide breadth of Christianity from around England. For millennia, different churches have split, argued, fought. Yet somehow we've found a way to sit in the same room together. We've recognized dialogue is better than death. Listening and understanding and being uncomfortable is more important than sat on your own trying to be right. 80 years ago, the Second World War ended, and under the cloud of the real extent of the Holocaust, something clear emerged. A need to come together, to listen, to talk and defend what makes us human. The United Nations, whose first meeting was at the Central Hall in Westminster, was a global visible commitment to working together to avoid war and build peace. And many of us are members of churches or parachurch agencies that have representation in the United Nations. And many of your women's groups may have been there last week, talking about issues as part of the build-up to the next global conversation about issues for women in the world today. Meanwhile, in 2028, we'll be marking 80 years of the World Council of Churches, a global expression to take more seriously Jesus' wish, the world will be one. Both these institutions reflect a longer-term reality that the church, which for reasons good and bad has developed global networks, works best when we come together, listen, learn, and pray. But also this global network is a way through which we can share a different story to the one we see online, in the media, and in the newspapers. Underground networks have moved and saved people from oppressed dictator states. Inspiring women have risen up, surrounded men as they failed to deliver peace, and demanded answers. Official and unofficial peace conferences have brought together people from all sorts of different theological backgrounds. The agency I worked for, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, founded in 1914 when the guns of the First World War were being fired, came about because since the 1890s, Lutherans, Quakers, and many more from all around Europe had gathered together to talk peace. But also small, quiet actors like the Reverend Harold Good in Northern Ireland, who was recognised as a decommissioner of weapons because he was impartial and respected. The Reverend Leslie Weatherhead wrote, "The glorious offer of the New Testament is that of a transforming, communicable sense of the power and presence of God." What greater transformation in self and world do we look for in ourselves and in others than trying to reject violence and walking that longer, harder path to living and working for peace? What unnumbered blessings may we encounter if we dare to act as individuals and churches as peace builders and peacemakers, rather than simply apologists and lamenters that another war has begun. War and violence is a sin in our local community, where young people are murdered by gun and knife crime. It's a sin on our nation and world when we see the poorest in our country and around the globe discarded so that more money instead can be redirected to fuel the guns and weapons of war. I'm in this work because my faith drives me to reject war and violence and look to walk the path of peace, because there is something more beautiful at the end. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. We live on a beautiful, wonderful planet, filled with beautiful, wonderful people, whose gifts and talents can transform, can feed, can nurture, can educate, can celebrate all that makes humanity beautiful. That is the hope. And Robin Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, says, for her we hear so much about hope. Hope for what? For her it's about helping people fall in love with the world again. And for as long as we allow the stain of war and conflict to exist, we can never fall in love with the world again, because too much is broken. But we're a people of hope. So let's hope, pray, and work that one day war and conflict will vanish. We will learn the lessons of our long and short history, and we'll use all our gifts and talents to celebrate the beauty and wonder of this world. Thank you.